All right, let me explain a few things to you. Now, when I did the most AMDXing, it was 1974. I had landed a job in RCA in Harrison. I was a life test technician, and what my duty was, I had all these chassis. They were half a television set. They had the high voltage, but they didn't have the picture tube. They had a yoke, they had the flyback, they had a damper tube, and they would get plugged into a rack system. And just say I had 250 of these units, all different kinds, for all different tubes. And the engineer would come up to me and he'd give me a test. He says, I want to run this tube at these parameters. And I would change resistors and capacitors in the fixture, and I would do 5 tubes, sometimes 10 tubes. And that's what I was doing. Now, RCA was coming to an end. Transistors were becoming more popular. RCA was in transistors, but they were doing them down in Princeton. So our company was getting ready to, they were going to shut our buildings down, and it was going to become part of the Route 80 exchange system. So everybody knew the end was coming. But what RCA did was they closed the factory down for Christmas. And a couple weeks before Christmas, a couple weeks after, I had to show up a certain day in the cafeteria in between, in the 4 weeks, and unemployment was in the cafeteria. They ran a slideshow showing you how to fill out the paperwork, and then they walked around and helped you with any problems you had. You handed your forms into the shop steward. The union was there, and you could go home now for 2 more weeks. And when you came back, you got a check. That's how they did it. There were so many people in RCA that got laid off that unemployment decided it would just do it that way. Make the people show up at the cafeteria, union shop steward guys, and the whole thing. It was just so much simpler. So I had 4 weeks off. And I also had hobbies of making root beer, making wine. I had a rock tumbler going, but oh, and I was also into long distance bike riding, but it's wintertime. So I was very laid back. I was probably the same weight I am now. I'm about 220 pounds, and I was getting lazy, heavy and lazy, and I was starting to become mellow. So one of the hobbies I did, I had that radio from I bought it from the kid when I was going to the school at Rets, and I would reset up the rock tumbler, make sure the wine was racked, the root beer was ready or whatever, and then I'd go up to my room, and I had built a box loop from, I think I got the plans from Elementary Electronics or one of them, and it was built with using wooden dowling. And I remember going to the the hobby store to get the wooden dowling, and there was a young girl, and she was, well, I won't say young girl about my age was working. Her job that she landed was working in the hobby shop, and I'm talking to her. I'm thinking, you know what? You should be out on a date with that girl instead of this. But I had landed a job that was very conservative. I was making better money than my last job. I was making more money than the other job with overtime. And it was RCA. And everybody, when they heard I worked there, they go, wow, that's pretty good. But anyway, so my hobby at night, because I have off every single day for 4 weeks, I would put the radio I had at that time, I told you, it was an NC 125. It used it had a dial cord with the needle on it. It wasn't like this radio. But I would, I used that book I showed you on the last video, told you about, and I would go up in frequency every night, a different frequency. And that was what I was doing. I remember it's 1974. Now I checked on the Barking Dogs that did Christmas song. They did Jingle Bells. And that came out in 1971. But in 74, that was the song they were playing. They hadn't done any Beatles songs yet. John Lennon, do they know it's Christmas? Or none of that had happened. The country was like I think we were out of the Vietnam War in '74. Well, anyway, the country was like in this slow mo. Some companies were closing down. There was some stuff, but I went to a very stable job every day. I made good money, and here I had a 4 week window. During the day, I helped some of the younger kids that were off school, off high school, work on their. One of them had a car they were working on, and I helped them. And the one older one, well, they were home for Christmas also. Let's put it that way. They weren't going to school. And during the day, I sort of did that. I had my other hobbies, and you go shopping for tools and whatever. But I remember it so vividly, and it was just before I became crazy. I mean, super crazy. Uh, when I was in RCA, at some point, I did a reunion with the guys I worked with at the previous job, and then I was also building digital clocks. And that guy I worked with at the previous job, he sent me a bunch of digital chips. He ended up working for Weston Meter up in Pennsylvania, and he could get all the ICs he wanted. He was a repair guy, so he sent me a box of integrated circuits, and I started building the digital clock. And then in RCA, I made contacts with people. The guy that was making digital clocks for RCA they would make clocks and give them as gifts to other companies that they did business with. And that guy gave me a schematic and then the remaining ICs that I needed to finish the clock. And then all hell broke loose. I started building digital circuits, getting into computers. Got laid off at RCA, started hanging at the Radio Shack, building all kinds of equipment. It became nonstop electronics. Right up until I was in TRW, I became a top tech there, and it just got maddening. I couldn't relax. I wound myself so tight, and it never stopped. After I quit TRW, I did the crank organ, the CNC stuff, and I was it was just nonstop. All right, but for me, I remember that moment where my dad had bought me that book with the that told me which frequencies, what stations were on, and that was the last video. But I remember I was very mellow. I could actually sit there night after night for so many hours and tune through the dial, and it really is funny. Like last night, I know let's see, 5400 is ISOP Long Island. I can't get it here yet. I've gotten it here before, but I was on 550 kilohertz last night, and there was a station there, perfectly clear. And I'm trying to decide if it's a Pennsylvania station or Buffalo, New York. And all of a sudden, I left the room. I come back in, it was gone. So it might have been a station that shut back at night. But anyway, I wasn't able to log the station on that frequency last night, any of the stations. Then in the middle of the night, I got to go to the bathroom. I turned the radio on. There was a station on that frequency. But that's how it is. It has to do with atmospheric conditions. So having the radio that you know is a certain amount of microvolt sensitivity, which this is, you just have to have a certain antenna. Now I'm using a 30-foot piece of wire, and I'm running it. Right now it's east to west in the house, on the floor. And when you want to receive a station in a certain state, the long wire should be pointed in that direction. You run it that length towards it. With a box loop, it's different. Okay, a box loop antenna, you aim the box loop itself, the end, at the station. It's a little bit different. It's like with a radio that's got a ferrite rod in it, you want the radio to be at 90 degrees to the station. But I remember that moment, I was up there, I had 4 weeks off. I knew I was going back to a job. I had already been in the cafeteria, and unemployment helped me fill out my application. So I knew when I come back, I was coming back to a check for 4 weeks. That's the way they did it. I was like, yeah, I was super lucky. And then I had told you the story that When RCA closed down, they laid me off. They made a mistake. They laid me off out of turn. They paid me money, but that went to the unemployment. Got that money. I had to give it to them, and then because they had been giving me money, and then they put me on Trade Readjustment Act. I was able to go back to school if I wanted to, or I made other plans. I had gotten into a place at the bottom floor, at the bottom. This guy hired me. He knew how good I was. He hired me, and I worked my way up there. So it all went good. I made lots of money, and then one day I wasn't happy anymore. Now, see, I have the option. I can read YouTube, and you see people going through what I went through. And my neighbors, they all worked. They didn't care how much of their soul they lost going to work, and it was bothering me. See, they had families. I was single. I had everything paid off. My parents had died. I owned a house. It was paid for. And I didn't see any really meaning of life. Yeah, I could get married and 50% of marriages fail. I could end up losing part of my house to someone that I thought I loved, that thought that they loved me. I didn't go through that. And there was no help because everyone in my neighborhood believed you just went to work every day. It was the male thing to do. And I started talking more radically, like, well, if you don't really like what you're doing, nobody does. They would tell you, no, that's not true. That's the way they live their life. And if you hang around with them and listen to them, basically, you start thinking like them and you're different. And that's where I made a mistake. But right now, I've got this radio all set for the wintertime. And just before bedtime every night, I will do a different frequency and see how many stations I get. But I want to tell you, back in 1974, the stations were different. You could land on one that was into home gardening. There was one that these programs are still out there, but not like they were. There was channels or stations that were on that did how to save money, how to invest your money. They're sort of ones now, but they try to get you to buy something that they're selling. It was different then. So you had raising different pets. You had gardening. You had money. You had your sports, and there's always two sports on. I think there's always football. Let's see, football and basketball. Yeah, you can have football and basketball. Then you can also have basketball and hockey. And I'm not a sports guy, but when you go up and down the dial, you would land either on a hockey game. Oh, and at some point, I think you can have baseball playoffs, hockey, and basketball. So as you're going up and down the dial, you're landing on stations that back in those days, people listened to AM radio because they would listen to the basketball, the hockey, and maybe baseball because they couldn't get to a television. They're at work, a night shift or whatever. It was totally different. And the commercials, they were annoying, but they were not as annoying as they are now. The FCC had a mandate that you can only have so many minutes of commercial per hour. They did away with that. That got lobbied out, all right? But I just want to tell you, when I talk about AM radio DXing, that's why I got into it, because being home for 4 weeks in the wintertime, I had my long distance bicycle ride. Can't do that. Too cold. I did help the guys during the day. They were home from school. Helped them with the car they were working on. I made my own root beer, my own wine, and I had a rock tumbler going. I probably had other stuff I was working on. But there were no digital clocks. I didn't own any digital circuits yet. I hadn't yet got laid off and started hanging at the Radio Shack, where I would meet people that would come in through the door, and they would get me excited about their project. I was able to help them, and it just got more. Oh, and CB radio became right around after 74, 75, first gas shortage. We had gone through a gas shortage working at RCA. I was able, if I had to take the bus to RCA or actually walk there. So I didn't have the anxiety that some of the people I worked with that lived down the, I won't say down the shore, but they lived down Rawway. It was a good hour ride by car, and they had a commute. And they had to worry about if they had enough gas. But these are the memories that are coming back to me looking at this dial, this radio. That's the National, and I had the NC 125, the same color radio. The knobs are the same, and the dial is better on this one than it was on the NC 125. It's more accurate. You can calibrate it and get the accuracy better. But I just wanted to just tell you, it's a pretty good hobby if you don't pay attention to the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is you really don't need to DX. You can go on the internet and listen to any station you want to. But back when I did it, there was no internet. You had three television channels that were big: NBC, CBS, NBC, and ABC. And then we also had some independent stations because I was near New York, and they would show old movies and stuff at night. And after a while, you just like saw that. This is a rerun. This is a rerun. And I don't think the Waltons had hit yet. There was some programs. It was just like everything was getting ready to move to the next level. And in 1974, for me, what I was involved in, there was a big brouhaha with American Can Company. American Can Company closed up over the weekend, didn't tell any of their employees. They come in on a Monday, and there was no company, and they didn't get to keep their pension. So a lot of these guys thought, you work 30 years for a company, and you retire, and you got to get a monthly $80, whatever it was, and the company just disappears in the middle of the night. So New Jersey immediately started telling companies, you have to tell us you actually have that money for those people. And if you close up, you have to give them the money. And RCA did. They gave me, it was like $48 their share because I was only here a year and a half or whatever. But in other words, a lot of companies just said, screw that, we're out of here. So by putting legislation through, a lot of companies just closed down. They didn't have the money for the people they were promising them money, but they were never going to get it. And they just closed down. And then there were people that would get in arguments. Well, if the government didn't step in, they would still be in business. Yeah, but you would never get your retirement. See, there are people that only understand one part of the circle. They don't understand the full circle. See, there were companies that were stringing people along with the carrot on the end of the stick. And then when they go to retire, the company says, we don't have the money for you. Or they close down just before these guys retire. Now, RCA made good on retirement because they had to. They didn't get out in time. Everybody in RCA that I worked with had 25 to 30 years with the company, and they didn't get any pension. The people that came in just before 65 and worked there got something. It was so unfair, but they treated us so good. Everybody looked the other way. They put people on Trade Readjustment Act for 2 years, and nobody complained. They did it that way. But RCA knew that all these people were hired right after World War II, well, some of them within the same day, and they were going to lay them all off, and they weren't going to get their pension. And they worked around it, but RCA basically got away without giving those people the pension. And I used to go visit some of them, and in their house they had RCA clocks for being there 15 years. And they had all these little doodads from the company, and they didn't get their pension. Where there were people that came in to RCA when they were 60 and only worked 15 years and got a pension. Where the guys that were there from World War II, after World War II, up until I think they closed the doors. The final doors closed in 1976. Those guys got screwed. But they got Trade Readjustment Act through the government for 2 years. You could go back to school, or you could just stay on Trade Readjustment Act until it ran out. And it was 75% of your salary. And then a lot of these guys would go on it. And I warned them, I said, you're old, you're going to go on that. And when you go look for a job, nobody's going to want you. And that's what happened. But a lot of these guys had some savings. They got some Social Security. And I would go visit them or call them up, and they were getting along. The wife was a little younger, and she was still working some kind of job. But that's all that comes streaming back to me when I start AMDXing. Okay, so you're going to understand it. That's why I'm telling you, a lot of your hobbies are based on some type of memory. You had a radio when you were a kid, and then you gave it away, and you were sorry you gave it away, or you always wanted a certain radio, and you finally got it. And then there's people that just collect stuff. And I also want, if you made it this far, there's a Panasonic, I believe there's a Panasonic 2200. It's supposed to be such a great radio. Well, what it is it's a really good, like, super radio. And it's supposed to be the most sensitive, least amount of noise. But we're talking a radio that's got a built-in antenna. Now, what you want is like a radio like an NC57. I told you what you got to do to it. You want to be up around 1 microvolt sensitivity. Then if you're lazy like me, you just use a piece of wire and you run it in different directions. And you do the full scale of the dial, and you log in what stations you can get. Then move it in a different direction and go back and do those frequencies again. Or build yourself a box loop and do it. It's a hobby in itself. There's no need for the hobby because you got the internet. But you just have to imagine what it would have been like in 1975. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. Wintertime, there really was nothing to do. I mean, even if you wanted to go, like you call a bunch of your friends up and you want to go bowling, well, you go bowling and there's leagues there. You can't bowl. There's things back then you couldn't just go do. Now, later on, like 75, they started putting skating rinks back in. There were skating rinks when I was a kid, ice skating, and then roller, then it died, and then it came back in like 75, so along with disco. But anyway, 1974 was like this law. I don't even think the Waltons were on yet. The programming on television, I don't know if the Beverly Hillbillies were on, but there was this even television. They did a purge of older television shows. MASH was still on there. I think MASH finished up. I think MASH finished up when I was in TRW. Yeah, but MASH was on. Archie Bunker was on. There were TV shows, but they were in reruns. So, like I said, at 4 weeks, and at night, you're really not tired enough to go to bed because you're younger. And there was no Saturday Night Live either. That came just a few months later. Everything in 1974 was just like there was no disco, or it might have been just starting. Yeah, everything was like, we had one gas shortage. Yeah, it's just like time. I won't say time was frozen, but for me, it sort of was electronically. Then I started, like I said, I started building digital clocks, digital thermometers, TV decoders, television. We started getting cable TV into the house, and I started working with decoder systems and stuff like that. But I just want to tell you, this is why I have this all set up now, because I can sort of relive of doing it, and it is sort of interesting. But the diversity of what you can listen to on AM dial is different than what it was. You could hear a guy with an accent in another state, and you knew approximately what state that was. See, now everybody sounds the same. They practice talking in a non-generic voice, and all radio announcers sort of sound the same. All right, I think that's it. All right, that's it.